Eva Carmichael had always loved flying, but tonight, as she walked the dimly lit aisle of Flight 927, a creeping sense of dread settled over her. Behind every closed eyelid she saw faces that weren't there. Passengers moved in ways that defied reality, and in row 17 a seatbelt tightened on its own as if waiting for her. Something on this plane wasn't human and it was already watching her every move. The night shift had always been my least favorite, but I had never felt this heavy unease before. Boarding the plane, the fluorescent lights in the cabin flickered briefly, and I swallowed hard, trying to push down the pit of anxiety growing in my stomach. Most passengers were already settled, their faces pale in the soft glow of the reading lamps, and the low hum of the engines filled the air like a lullaby gone wrong. I moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, trays, and overhead bins, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the luggage locks. Normally, I would have hummed a tune, something to ease the hours of monotony, but tonight I couldn't summon a single note. Something about this flight felt different, wrong in a way I couldn't place. As I reached row 17, my steps slowed. The seat there was empty, though I was certain it had been occupied. Hours earlier, I had helped a man settle in, carefully placing his small carry-on beneath the seat and adjusting the belt across his lap. He had nodded politely, a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and then he had gone silent, staring out the window at the black sky beyond. I had thought nothing of it at the time, but now the empty cushion seemed to pulse with absence, like a heartbeat I could feel in the air. I checked the passenger list on my tablet. His name was still marked on board. My fingers hovered over the screen, reluctant to scroll, as a cold shiver ran down my spine. I walked toward the back of the plane, forcing myself to rationalize. He must have gone to the restroom. Hours at cruising altitude could make anyone fidgety, and maybe I had simply lost track of him, but the lavatories were empty, each one spotless and silent, the lights bright and unwelcoming. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. If he wasn't in the seat, and he wasn't in the restroom, then where could he be? I glanced around the aisle, scanning every row, every shadow, but there was nothing. The other passengers remained asleep, unaware, perfectly ordinary, and yet the silence was too thick, almost suffocating. I returned to row 17. The seatbelt was fastened across the empty seat, pulled tight as if someone invisible had buckled it themselves. My heart thumped in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I reached out tentatively, fingers brushing the cold buckle, and it felt real, tangible. But there was no one there. My mind raced to pressure fatigue, a trick of the lighting. I shook my head, trying to calm the rising panic that made my hands tremble. Yet I couldn't tear my gaze away from that empty seat. The cabin lights hummed softly above, casting long shadows along the aisle. I walked to the galley, trying to steady my breath, telling myself it was just the late hour, just the monotony, just the endless expanse of night outside. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw a pale shape at the far end of the aisle. My pulse skipped. I spun toward it, but there was nothing there. Only the dim, swaying lights and rows of sleeping passengers. I blinked rapidly, my mind searching for sense in the shapes of shadows and the play of light. My rational brain whispered explanations, fatigue, nerves, imagination running wild. But a part of me knew it wasn't imagination. I moved back to row 17 again, my steps hesitant, as though approaching the unknown might somehow make it worse. The overhead compartment above the seat had been pulled open. My stomach twisted. I didn't remember opening it, and no one else had boarded here. I stepped closer, peering inside. Nothing unusual appeared at first glance, just a few jackets and bags until something shifted. A small, dark object rolled slightly, though no hand had touched it. My breath caught. I leaned in closer, trying to see, and the air around me felt colder, heavier, like the plane itself had taken a breath and held it. I straightened up, heart hammering, and forced myself to continue the safety check. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get to the cockpit, to run from this corridor that felt alive with something unseen. But duty kept me moving, forcing me along the narrow aisle. With every step, the unease deepened. The quiet of the passengers, the steady drone of the engines, the dim lights above it all combined into a pressure that pressed down on my chest. It wasn't just the missing man, I realized, was something else, something larger, something in the shadows that had been waiting for this moment. When I glanced back at row 17 once more, my stomach dropped. The empty seat seemed different. It wasn't just empty. It was expectant, as if it knew I was watching. The seatbelt tightened slightly on its own, a subtle, unnatural movement. I froze, unable to look away. The cabin suddenly too quiet, too still. A chill ran along my spine, and for the first time in my life, I understood what fear really felt like at 30,000 feet. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Long flights did strange things to the mind-recycled air, the steady vibration of the engines. Exhaustion bending perception until shadows became figures and whispers became voices. I forced a slow, steady breath and walked down the aisle again, my shoes clicking lightly on the linoleum floor. Row 17 remained my focus. The empty seat with the fastened seatbelt seemed almost alive, as if it were daring me to look away. I wanted to close the overhead bin above it, tuck everything neatly away, and pretend nothing had happened. But my hands wouldn't obey. They hovered, trembling slightly, over the cold metal latch. I reached out and touched the buckle. It was heavier than it should have been. I jerked my hand back and blinked rapidly. Certain exhaustion was warping my senses. I forced myself to continue toward the back galley, hoping movement would ease the tension. That's when it happened. The lights flickered. Just a quick, almost imperceptible flicker, but it was enough to make my heart lurch. Shadows stretched across the seats, crawling along the floor, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the aisle, tall and pale. My stomach dropped. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone. I tried to laugh it off. Of course, no one would believe me. They would say it was stress or fatigue. But the instinctive dread in my chest refused to quiet. I moved past the first few rows, checking seat numbers almost mechanically. Everyone was asleep, or at least appeared to be, but their stillness felt unnatural. Their breathing, quiet and uniform, carried a rhythm that made the cabin feel like a living organism, watching, waiting. My eyes kept drifting back to row 17, and each time the seatbelt seemed a little tighter, as if my gaze alone had pulled it into place. I told myself to check the lavatories again. Maybe the man had returned and I simply hadn't noticed. But each door I opened revealed only emptiness. Bright lights glaring down on cold stainless steel fixtures. No one was there. The sound of my own breath echoed off the walls, and the hum of the engines seemed louder, more insistent, as if the plane itself were aware of my panic. When I finally turned back toward the aisle, my blood ran cold. In the reflection of the small glass on the galley door, I saw him. The missing man from row 17 was standing behind me. His posture was stiff, unnervingly upright, and his eyes were wide, hollow, fixed on my reflection. I spun around, heart hammering, and the aisle was empty. Nothing moved except the dim shadows stretching along the seats. I swallowed hard, trying to force reason into the fear that paralyzed me. Maybe I had been staring too long, the reflection playing tricks. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was something else. I forced myself back to the seat, back to row 17. The overhead bin was still open, and my stomach twisted as I stepped closer. I didn't want to see what might be inside, but I had to check. The bag that had been here before was gone, replaced by a small, unidentifiable object that shifted slightly on its own. I leaned over, and the cold metal of the bin pressed against my hands. For a moment I thought I felt a brush against my fingertips, soft, almost like hair. I jerked back violently, my chest tight, and the bin slammed shut with a force that rattled the surrounding seats. I tried to calm myself. This was ridiculous. No one could vanish into thin air. No bag could move on its own. And yet, the feeling of being watched pressed against my skin like invisible fingers. I continued down the aisle slowly, trying not to look directly at anyone. Every passenger seemed unnervingly still, but something about their posture was off. Their heads tilted slightly, just enough to make them seem aware of me even as they slept. I quickened my pace, glancing at the ceiling lights, hoping the fluorescent hum would drown out the quiet dread in my mind. When I reached the back of the plane, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, pressing along the aisle toward me. I could feel the air grow colder, heavier, as if the plane itself had shifted, closing in. A strange metallic scent filled my nostrils, faint but persistent. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just nerves. But then I noticed the emergency exit at the very back. Someone or something had traced shapes into the condensation on the window. Jagged lines, crude and sharp, dripping as though freshly carved. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached toward the glass, and the shapes seemed to writhe subtly, like they were alive. My heart raced. I wanted to leave, to flee to the cockpit, to escape this creeping nightmare. But as I turned, the soft, synchronized sound of breathing filled the cabin. It wasn't one passenger, not even two, it was all of them. Row after row, each passenger exhaling and inhaling in perfect unison, a rhythm too precise to be natural. The sound pressed against my ears, and I stumbled back, nearly colliding with the seat. I had to get out, to run, but every step felt heavier than the last. The aisle seemed to lengthen, stretching endlessly before me. And then, just as I froze in fear, a single head in row 17 turned toward me. The eyes remained closed, but the lips parted, and from that silent mouth came a low, crackling static, filling the aisle with a sound that didn't belong. I stood frozen, breath caught, trapped between disbelief and terror. The plane was no longer ordinary. The night was no longer safe. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of engines and flickering lights, I understood that this flight had become something alive and it was watching me. I couldn't stop thinking about the seat in row 17. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but I felt drawn back to it as though something invisible were pulling me forward. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that the mind played cruel tricks on weary flight attendants during late-night shifts, but the unease had become unbearable. The metallic hum of the engines, the dim flickering of the cabin lights, even the soft breathing of the passengers, all of it seemed wrong now, as if the plane were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I approached the seat again, my steps hesitant, my heart thundering. The seatbelt remained fastened across the cushion, tighter than ever, and the overhead bin above it remained slightly ajar, shadows crawling along the edges. I forced myself to peer inside. My stomach lurched. The bag that had vanished before was back, but it didn't look the same. It seemed older, worn, almost decayed. I knelt down to examine it, and the zipper moved slightly, as if something inside were breathing. My hands shook, hovering over the cold metal teeth of the zipper. Finally, I pushed it open. Inside were items that made no sense: a child's small broken toy airplane, a woman's scarf, and an old passport belonging to someone who wasn't on this flight. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The bag, this single small bag, seemed to contain fragments of strangers, their lives stitched together inside this confined space. A chill ran through me, and I nearly dropped the bag when I saw it. An oxygen mask, torn from the plane's ceiling and stuffed haphazardly inside. It was twisted and frayed, and as I stared at it, I thought I could hear a faint whisper, like someone breathing softly just beyond my hearing. I stumbled backward, bumping into the aisle seat. The cabin felt different now, heavier, denser, as though the very air had grown thick and viscous. I moved down the aisle, trying to reassure myself that I had imagined it all, but the further I went, the more I realized I was not alone. The passengers, everyone around me, were still asleep, but their breathing had changed. It wasn't the gentle rhythm of rest anymore. It was strange, mechanical, perfectly synchronized, as though some unseen conductor guided them all. Row by row, their chests rose and fell together, a single organism in the darkness. I felt my knees weaken and pressed my palms against the back of a seat. The static in my ears from the seatbelt earlier grew louder, more insistent, spreading, until it seemed to vibrate inside my skull. I wanted to leave, to reach the cockpit, to run, but the aisle stretched endlessly, and every passenger remained unnervingly still, their faces pale and expressionless. And then I saw it, a movement so subtle I almost missed it. One passenger, a woman in row 12, twitched in her sleep. Her fingers flexed as though grabbing at something unseen. I gasped, and more passengers twitched in perfect unison, a wave of unnatural life stirring through the cabin. I hurried to the cockpit door, desperate for safety, but when I reached it, my stomach turned. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the low cabin pressure. I pushed it open and froze. The seats were empty. Both pilots were gone. Their headsets swayed gently from the controls, tapping against the dashboard. The autopilot lights glowed softly, keeping the plane on its course, but the cockpit felt abandoned, haunted, the air thick with absence. I stumbled back, nearly tripping, and the static grew louder, now filling the cabin in waves. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My voice had vanished along with my courage. I turned slowly back toward the cabin, heart hammering, and that's when I saw him again, the missing man from row 17. His posture was wrong, stiff, almost exaggerated, and his eyes were black voids. He raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and in that moment, I understood something terrifying. He wasn't missing. He had never been missing. He had been waiting. The passengers around him began to stir unnaturally, their movements jerky and mechanical. Their heads turned in unison, eyes still closed, lips moving silently. I watched in horror as the overhead bins above each row began to creak open on their own. One by one, objects spilled out. Bags, jackets, shoes, letters, scraps of paper. They tumbled to the floor, yet no one reached to pick them up. Some of the items belonged to people who had never boarded this flight: old passports, family photographs, small personal belongings from lives I couldn't recognize. The static coalesced into something intelligible, a low chorus of voices whispering just beyond comprehension. I backed into the aisle, the plane's floor seeming to tilt beneath me. The passengers' synchronized breathing rose into a low, unified chant, and I realized with dawning terror that the cabin itself was alive, aware of me, aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every fearful thought. My vision blurred, and the whispering grew louder, closer, more insistent, until it became a voice, my own name, calling from every direction at once, pulling me toward row 17. I collapsed to my knees, unable to tear my gaze from that empty, expectant seat, and understood the truth. Whatever was in that seat, whatever had been hiding behind the shadows and whispers, was waiting for me. Waiting for the moment I realized that the plane, the passengers, the very air around me, had changed, and that no matter what I did, I could never leave. The cabin no longer felt like it belonged to this world. Every step I took down the aisle pressed the fear deeper into my chest, making it hard to breathe. The lights flickered again, a dim, stuttering glow that painted the seats in gray shadows, elongating forms into impossible shapes. Passengers remained in their seats, but the stillness was different now. Their heads tilted slightly, subtle movements that suggested awareness even as their eyes stayed closed. The synchronized breathing continued, low and rhythmic, filling the cabin with a sense of something unnatural, something alive. I forced myself to keep moving, forcing each step even as panic coiled in my stomach like a living thing. I reached row 12 again, where the woman had twitched earlier. Now, Several passengers showed small mechanical jerks, limbs twitching almost like puppets on invisible strings. I swallowed hard, realizing I could no longer distinguish between the living and the dead. The plane, the very air, seemed to hum with a presence I couldn't name. Each row I passed felt heavier, as if some invisible weight pressed down from above, and the static in my ears had grown into a constant, throbbing vibration that made my teeth ache. At the back of the plane, the emergency exit window drew my attention again. The jagged symbols traced in the condensation had multiplied. Now they seemed to writhe subtly, moving as though something beneath the glass shifted. I reached toward the window, hand trembling, and the cold pressed back against my palm like the grip of a frozen hand. I could feel the air inside the cabin chill further, each breath visible in the dim light, swirling upward into shadows. Something was out there, or maybe in here. I didn't know anymore, and the uncertainty clawed at my sanity. I backed away from the window, and that's when the whispering began. It was low at first, almost drowned out by the hum of the engines, but it grew steadily louder, echoing off the walls. I tried to locate the source, but it came from everywhere at once, from the overhead bins, the seats, the ceiling, the walls. My own name was repeated, not as a call for attention but as a warning. I turned toward row 17 and froze. The seatbelt was now fully taut, as though tightened by unseen hands. The bag in the overhead bin had shifted slightly, as if acknowledging my presence. I stumbled toward the galley, trying to find something to steady myself, anything to break the spell that seemed to clutch at the plane. The static and whispers followed, rising in intensity, twisting into low moans that vibrated in my chest. My reflection in the small window of the galley door caught my eye, and my stomach dropped. The missing man stood behind me again, but now his face was different. Not human, not completely. His features stretched and contorted, as if skin had been pulled too tight over something monstrous underneath. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. My own reflection, however, still showed him behind me, grinning with hollow eyes. I had to reach the cockpit. It was the only place I could imagine safety, though even the thought felt fragile, meaningless. I ran, each step heavy, echoing unnaturally in the cabin. The passengers around me twitched and moved in perfect synchronization, their heads turning toward me in unison, lips opening and closing silently. I passed over fallen objects from the overhead bins, old shoes, letters, passports, scraps of fabric all strewn across the aisle like evidence of lives that had been collected, stolen, or abandoned. The sense of weight pressed on me even more heavily, each breath a struggle as though the plane itself resisted my movement. When I reached the cockpit door, my blood ran cold. It was no longer just azure, it hung crooked, as though forced open by something from within. I peeked inside. The seats were empty, the pilots gone. Only their headsets remained, dangling from the controls like lifeless vines. The autopilot glowed faintly, keeping the plane on course, but the feeling of abandonment was complete. I stumbled backward, turning my eyes to the cabin, and the passengers were all upright now, unmoving, silent, eyes still closed, their synchronized breathing louder than ever. Then I noticed the man in row 17 again. He raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and the static and whispering intensified, filling the cabin to a near-deafening level. The other passengers remained seated, unmoving, except for slight twitches, but I knew they were now aware of me, of my fear, and of the vulnerability that had drawn me to this moment. My legs felt like lead, my vision blurred, and the air pressed tighter, colder, more oppressive. The whispers became words, fragmented and broken, but unmistakably clear. "You can't leave." I stumbled forward, my back hitting the wall of the galley, heart racing, unable to scream, unable to breathe normally. The plane felt alive, every vibration and sound magnified, every shadow stretching closer. The weight of the passengers, the missing man, the objects scattered across the aisle, and the whispers combined into a single, suffocating presence. I understood then, with a clarity that made my blood run cold, that this flight was no longer a route through the skies. It had become a trap, a living, watching entity, and I was its focus. Row 17, the missing man, the objects, the shadows, the whispers. They were all waiting for the moment I fully realized that escape was impossible. And in that moment, the overhead bin above row 17 creaked open once more, revealing the contents inside. Shifting slightly, as if inviting me to look closer, my stomach twisted, my chest tightened, and I knew with a certainty I could not shake that whatever had taken this plane, whatever haunted these passengers, was about to claim my attention fully, and I had nowhere to hide. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, my chest constricted as if the plane itself were squeezing the air from me. The cabin had become something alive, something aware, and every instinct screamed that I was the focus. Row 17 drew my eyes like a magnet, the empty seatbelt tight across the cushion, the overhead bin slightly ajar. The bag inside shifted again, subtly, as though whatever was within it were conscious, waiting. I wanted to look away, to run to the cockpit, but my feet refused to obey. The static and whispering had become deafening, filling my ears, vibrating through my skull, chanting my name over and over in a chorus of disembodied voices. I staggered down the aisle, past the rows of passengers who remained upright, eyes closed, synchronized breathing like the pulse of a single monstrous entity. Objects spilled from overhead bins, letters, shoes, scraps of clothing, old photographs, but they seemed irrelevant now. Background noise to the real horror. The missing man stood in the aisle, impossibly tall, his face stretching and shifting as though multiple faces were layered beneath the skin, writhing just beneath the surface. His hand rose slowly, deliberately, and all at once, the entire cabin exhaled a soundless moan, pressing it against me like a physical force. I reached the cockpit door and tried to push it open, but it resisted, as if something beyond it were holding it shut. I pressed my shoulder against the metal, my nails scraping the surface, and finally it swung open. The seats were empty. The pilots were gone. Only their dangling headsets swayed, brushing against the controls. The autopilot blinked steadily, keeping the plane on course, as though indifferent to the nightmare inside the cabin. I leaned against the frame, gasping for air, realizing that safety was an illusion. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The whispering turned into words I could understand now, layered and overlapping, coming from every direction at once. You were never on this flight. My stomach twisted violently. I staggered backward, heart hammering, trying to process the meaning. I had been careful, meticulous, recording passenger counts, checking every row, following protocol. Every action, every observation had felt real, but now, the horrifying truth pressed on my mind. None of it had been real. This plane, these passengers, even myself, I had never boarded. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching the aisle carpet, and looked at row 17. The missing man's face was closer now, impossibly near, eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the cabin. The seatbelt tightened on its own again, and the bag in the overhead bin rattled violently. I knew, with an awful certainty, that it wasn't just waiting, it had been waiting for me all along. A part of me screamed to run, to wake up, to close my eyes and pray for reality to return. But the whispers enveloped me, promising that no such escape existed. I forced myself to rise, stumbling toward the galley, my gaze darting to each row. The passengers didn't move in the way humans should. Their skin seemed gray, waxy, stretched unnaturally tight, lips parted in silent chanting, hands twitching in rhythms I couldn't comprehend. The static, the whispers, the synchronized breathing, it all became one, a living entity that pulsed through the cabin, through the plane itself, and into my body. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped, only a vibration of panic echoing in my skull. Row 17 loomed ahead, the man's hand still raised, beckoning or commanding, I couldn't tell which. The bag tipped slightly out of the bin, spilling a few small objects onto the aisle, a child's toy, a crumpled photograph, and a torn page from an old journal. Each item seemed impossibly significant, yet entirely meaningless to me. And then I saw Ita's reflection in the small window of the galley. My own face stared back at me, pale and hollow, but behind it was another face, superimposed, twisted, smiling with something that was not human. I fell backward, and the cabin seemed to stretch around me, walls elongating, seats rising like dark towers. The plane's engines droned softly, indifferent, but the air inside was alive, pressing on me, pulling me toward row 17. The whispers became words again. You belong here now. You always belonged. My vision blurred, panic and terror coiling into a single suffocating mass. I tried to resist, to flee, to deny it, but the realization hit me like ice water. Every step I had taken, every breath I had drawn, had led me here. The flight itself had been a trap, a lure, and I had walked willingly into it without knowing it. The last thing I remember before darkness overtook me was the man leaning closer, the passengers breathing forming a single horrifying chorus, and the bag tipping fully out of the overhead bin, revealing objects that should not exist, pieces of lives I could never understand. Then the cabin went completely silent, the lights extinguished, leaving only a void in which the whispers continued. Now in my own voice, repeating endlessly, you were never on this flight. The plane continued on through the endless night, autopilot steady, the world outside, oblivious, as if nothing had changed. And in the darkness, I understood the final terrifying truth. The flight would never end, and neither would the waiting.